Greetings, and welcome to the audio lessons presented by Northwest Church of Christ in Austin, Texas. We're happy you chose to join us today. Today we'll begin a series of 10 lessons on the book of Esther. Esther is the last book of history of the Old Testament, and while it's the last book listed chronologically, the events recorded fall between Ezra chapters 6 and 7. It is one of two biblical books named after a woman. The other is Ruth. It is one of two Old Testament books set completely outside of Palestine. The other is Big Daniel. As such, there's a lot of Persian influence in both books. It is the only biblical book in which there is no mention of God's name. And this may be why Esther is the only Old Testament book not found in the Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts. There have been 6 additions to Esther made later in the book, and in 1546, they were included in the Catholic Bible. They are in the Apocrypha under the title of Additions to Esther. They are not inspired, and in several instances contradict the original Hebrew text. They were written sometime in the mid-200s BC by Jewish rabbis who wanted to fill in the gaps and give the book a more religious character. For example, a prayer for Mordecai when he reads Haman's edict, and a prayer from Esther before she goes to see the king are included. We do not know who wrote the book of Esther, but the book contains internal hints as to the characteristics of the author. The Jewish nationalism expressed throughout the book and the emphasis on the Jewish feast of Purim indicate he was a Jew. There's no mention of Judah or Jerusalem. The only city mentioned is Susa or Shushan, suggesting it was his residence. He was familiar with the Persian court and the customs and the details of the reigns of Ahasuerus, even including the dinnerware used at the banquet and the design of the interior court. Just an aside here, Ahasuerus is his Hebrew name. He is better known by his Greek name, Xerxes, and I will refer to him as Xerxes because that's just easier for me. So, he's a Jew in exile, probably in service to Xerxes. Some suggest Mordecai is the author. Possibly, but in Esther 10:2, Mordecai is spoken of in the past tense. This has led some to suppose the writer was an acquaintance of Mordecai, perhaps a younger co-worker or an apprentice. Such a one would have had opportunity to eyewitness the events and would have had access to the official king's chronicles to supply some of the details. Some have suggested Ezra as the author, and their argument goes like this. It is likely that Ezra was born in Susa or somewhere nearby. Ezra 7 tells us only that he came up from Babylon to Jerusalem. Since Ezra led the second return of the Jews in 457 BC, and since in the ancient Oriental economy a male was not considered fully mature until the age of about 30, Ezra was at least 30 years old in 457 BC. Since he's described as a skilled scribe and a leader of the Jews, he was probably much older. It takes some time to be skilled in an occupation, and you probably want somebody who's seasoned to lead you on a long journey, much like the old trail masters leading the pioneers across the American West. Nehemiah led a group back to Jerusalem in 443 BC, and in Nehemiah 8, Ezra reads the law to them. Everything I read about Ezra indicates that he was born in 480 BC. I'm not sure how that was determined. That would make him only 23 when he led the second return in 457 BC. I can't see that happening. One source said that was 480 BC was when he became prominent, making his birth year 510 BC or earlier. That makes more sense to me. If this is the fact, Ezra would have been at least 53 when he led the second return of the exiles. In Nehemiah 8, when he read the law, he would have been about 67 years old. He would have been about 24 when Xerxes took the throne. He would have been about 36 when the edicts of Haman and Mordecai were issued, and about 37 when the attacks on the Jews occurred, and would have been involved actively in the self-defense. Some have speculated that because Ezra had ready access to the king, as evidenced in Ezra 7, and was a skilled scribe, he may have had some governmental office much like Mordecai. If so, he would have had an intimate knowledge of the customs and the buildings of the Persian court. Putting this all together, some authors suggest Ezra as the author of the book of Esther. I tend to lean toward that, but I wouldn't be dogmatic about it. Although we can with great confidence place the dates of the main events of the book, that's 483 to 472 BC. When it was written is unknown. The Persian ruler is Ahasuerus, again a Hebrew translation for the Persian Kheshayarsha, in Greek Xerxes, who reigned from 486 BC to 465 BC. Since his reign is spoken of in the past in Esther 10, 2 and 3, it must have been written after 465 BC. Esther 9:19 indicates the Feast of Purim had been observed for some time after writing, possibly beginning to commemorate the event the following year in 472 BC, on the anniversary of the attack. The absence of any Greek or Hellenistic influence suggests it was written before Persia fell to the Greeks in 331 BC. The Hebrew dialect, I'm told, that is used is like that used in both Ezra and Nehemiah, both written between 433 and 424 BC. Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian, writes that the entire Jewish scriptures were written, that is, they were completed, from Moses to Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes was Xerxes' son, who reigned from 464 to 424 BC. That puts the date between 465 and 424 BC. Of course, there's always an outlier, and one group of thinkers uses the last section of additions to Esther, again, not an inspired work, to date the book. It reads, "In the 4th year of the reign of Ptolemy and Cleopatra, Dositheus, who said he was a priest and a Levite, and Ptolemy, his son, brought to Egypt a preceding letter of Purim, which they said was genuine and had been translated by Lysimachus, the son of Ptolemy, one of the residents of Jerusalem." This would place the writing of the book much later, no earlier than 200 BC, possibly as late as 140 BC, again, depending upon which Ptolemy and Cleopatra are referenced. There were 3 different Ptolemies paired with 4 different Cleopatras from 204 to 116 BC. In view of that, it's likely that the 465 to 424 BC dates are more accurate. We said that the events of Esther can be dated with great confidence. All the events occurred between 483 and 473 BC, and that's confirmed by internal evidence in the book and historical evidence. Let's review a little ancient Middle Eastern history. In 722 BC, the Assyrians under Shalmaneser defeat the northern kingdom of Israel under Hosea, and it takes Israel as captives to Assyria. Shalmaneser then repopulates Israel with Assyrians, and this is the origin of the Samaritans. In 625 BC, the Babylonians under Nabopolassar defeat Assyria. In 606 BC, Nabopolassar places Nebuchadnezzar, his son, over the Babylonian army. Interestingly enough, 1 year later, in 605, Nebuchadnezzar is now king of Babylon after Nabopolassar's death. He was assassinated by his guards. Judah under Jehoiakim becomes a vassal state to Babylonia. Daniel and others are taken captive to Babylonia and begins the Babylonian captivity. In 597 BC, Jehoiakim rebels against Nebuchadnezzar. He attempts an alliance with Egypt, which Jeremiah had warned him against. Nebuchadnezzar squashes the rebellion and takes Jehoiakim and others captive. This is the second exile of the Jews. In 586 BC, Judah under Zedekiah rebels. Nebuchadnezzar defeats Judah. Zedekiah's sons are killed before his eyes, and then his eyes are put out. Zedekiah and the rest of Judah are taken captive, and Jerusalem is destroyed. This is the third exile of the Jews. In 539 BC, Belshazzar is now king of Babylon, and Cyrus is king of Persia. Belshazzar sees literally the handwriting on the wall, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Sarin. He had been numbered and weighed by God, found wanting, and his kingdom would be lost. Belshazzar is defeated and killed by Darius the Mede that night, as referenced in Daniel 5:31. Darius the Mede may be another name for Cyrus, a Babylonian throne name, Darius the Mede being his actual name. Some suggest it may be Gubaru, one of Cyrus's generals who captured the city of Babylon during the invasion. I don't see that's the case, because in 538 BC, Cyrus issues the proclamation allowing the repatriation of the Jews to Palestine and Jerusalem. A general just would not have had that kind of stroke. Also in Daniel 6:28, it says that Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus. I'm no Hebrew scholar, but what I've read says that the construction of that sentence could easily be retranslated as Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius, that is, the reign of Cyrus. In this case, both names pointing to the same man. The proclamation allowing the repatriation of the Jews was prophesied in Isaiah 44:28. Let's read that, beginning in chapter 44, verse 24, through 45:10, just for context. I'll be reading from the English Standard Version. Thus said the Lord, your Redeemer, who formed you in from the womb. I am the Lord who made all things, who alone stretched out the heavens, who spread out the earth by myself, who frustrates the signs of liars, who makes fools of diviners, who turn wise men back and make their knowledge foolish, who confirms the word of his servant and fulfills the counsel of his messengers, who says of Jerusalem, she shall be inhabited, and in the cities of Judah they shall be built, and I will rise up their ruins, who says to the deep, be dry, I will dry up your rivers, who says to Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall fulfill my purpose, saying of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and of the temple your foundation shall be laid. In chapter 45, thus says the Lord to his anointed Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue the nations before him, and to loose the belts of kings, to open the doors before him, that the gates might not be closed. I will go before you and level the exalted places. I will break in pieces the doors of bronze and cut through the bars of iron. I will give you treasures of darkness and hoards of secret places, that you may know that it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who called you by name. For the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel, my chosen, I call you by your name. I name you, though you do not know me. I am the Lord, there is no other. Beside me there is no God. I equip you, though you do not know me, that people may know from the rising of the sun and from the west, there is none beside me. I am the Lord, there is no other. I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. I am the Lord who does all these things. Isaiah prophesied between 740 and 860 BC, so this prophecy is at least 140 years prior to the proclamation. In 536 BC, we have the first return of the Jews, 50,000 of them roughly, back to Jerusalem under Zerubbabel, ending the Babylonian captivity. In 521, Darius I, or Darius the Great, the grandson of Cyrus, is king of Persia. He reigns from 521 to 486 BC. It is during his reign in 515 BC that the temple in Jerusalem is completed, as referenced in Ezra 6. In 486 BC, Xerxes is king of Persia. He reigns from 486 to 465. In 465, Artaxerxes I is king of Persia. He reigns from 465 to 424 BC. In 457 BC, during Artaxerxes' reign, is the second return of the Jews to Jerusalem under Ezra, as referenced in Ezra 7, and again under Artaxerxes' reign in 443 BC, the third return of the Jews to Jerusalem under Nehemiah. We are told it was the 20th year of Artaxerxes' reign, and that's referenced in Nehemiah 2. The events of Esther occupy a very small sliver of time throughout this time frame, so maybe it would be good to review the events of the book of Esther. The book opens with a large royal banquet being held for all his, that is Xerxes, officials and servants, the army of Persia and Media, and the nobles and governors of all the provinces. It is at this banquet at which Queen Vashti is deposed. Esther 1:3 tells us it was the third year of Xerxes' reign, or 483 BC. Why was Xerxes having this banquet? Secular history tells us he was planning to invade and conquer Greece, something his grandfather Cyrus was never able to do. The banquet with all the notables of the empire was laying the groundwork of building public support for the campaign. In 480 BC, Xerxes attacks Greece at Thermopylae, and this is the event of the 300 Spartans' fame, and he wins. From there, the Persian army chases the Greeks fleeing to Athens, to the island of Salamis. Greece, outnumbered, but with smaller and more maneuverable ships, engages the Persian navy at the Bay of Salamis and defeats Persia. In 479 BC, Persia attacks Greece at Plataea. Greece defeats Persia, and Xerxes heads home to Susa, unable to conquer Greece. So when Esther 2 opens with, "After these things," when the anger of the king Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. The reason it takes Xerxes 3 years to remember Vashti is because he's been out of the empire in a campaign against Greece. Esther 2:16 tells us that Esther was made queen in the 7th year of Xerxes' reign, or 479 BC. In Esther 3:7, Haman cast lots, that is the Persian word for poor, that's the lot. He cast lots against the Jews in the 12th year of Xerxes' reign, or 474 BC. The date determined for the attack on the Jews was 11 months later in 473 BC. In 473 BC, we have the attack of the Jews self-defense, Haman and his sons killed, and the Feast of Purim established and first observed on the anniversary of the attack in 472 BC. While the book of Esther is included in both the Hebrew and Christian canons, it's not without its detractors. Some doubt the historicity of the book and consider it a myth or a legend, a saga, an apocryphal, or even allegorical. Their objections fall around 5 basic things. The greatest source of information we have about the reign of Xerxes is the Greek historian Herodotus. He does not mention in his volumes either Vashti or Esther as queens of Xerxes' reign. Well, that's okay. He often fails to mention people, such as Belshazzar in Daniel 5. He does report that Xerxes sought consolation from his harem after his defeat at Plataea, the year Esther was made queen, 479 BC. And since Xerxes was a polygamist, and to the ancient Middle Eastern mind, women were not important, it's not unexpected that Herodotus would not mention a queen by name. The second objection has to do with the self-defense of the Jews. They say the number of Persians killed by the Jews in one day in their defense, 75,000. They object to the apparent vindictiveness of Esther in asking Xerxes to extend Mordecai's self-defense edict one more day in Susa, allowing more enemies to be killed. And they object to the hanging of Haman's 10 sons, even after they were dead. Considering the extent of the Persian Empire at the time, stretching from India in the east to Asia Minor and parts of Macedonia in the west, including parts of Egypt and Ethiopia and Tunisia, and in the north, parts of what is modern-day Kazakhstan, and that this was an empire-wide edict, 75,000 would have been considered a small number. When you consider that Mordecai's edict allowed only for self-defense and not for offense, that probably helped keep the numbers down. It looks like Esther's request to extend the edict in Susa one day may have been an offensive measure, and we will get into that when we get to chapter 9. The book promotes a feast not prescribed by the law of Moses, the Feast of Purim. That's true, and more on that again in chapter 9. Some say that the book contains no mention of God, worship, the temple, Jerusalem, prayer, sacrifice, or the law of Moses. Fasting is only mentioned and observed once. Martin Luther said the book was too aggressively Jewish, and it is, and that it contained no gospel content. Well, if you take away God's providence in preventing the destruction of the Jewish race through which came our Savior, I suppose you could say that's true. It may be that the author deliberately left out any reference to God or any religious activity, except for the mourning in sackcloth and ashes and fasting, to heighten the fact that God is in control and He directs the seemingly insignificant coincidences that make up the plot of Esther and issues forth in the deliverance of the Jews. God's presence is presumed in every point and most forcefully confirmed in the key passage of the book, Esther chapter 4, verses 13 and 14. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, Relief and deliverance will rise from the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" The historicity of the book has long been questioned because Mordecai's name has not been found in any ancient records. He rose to second only to Xerxes, and he should have been mentioned, as was Haman, in the same position. That changed when the archaeological discovery of inscriptions mentioning an official in Xerxes' court in Susa named Marduk-Ayah. Mordecai? Why was the book of Esther written? Yes, it tells of a young Jewish girl who became queen of Persia and foiled a plot to destroy the Jews, preserving the Jewish nation. But the primary reason of the book is to explain the Feast of Purim. Why did the Feast of Purim need to be explained? Well, let's look at another timeline. In 605 BC, we have the first exile of the Jews, the beginning of the Babylonian captivity. In 597 BC, we have the second exile of the Jews under Jehoiakim. And in 586 BC, the third exile under Zedekiah. In 536, we have the first return of the Jews under Zerubbabel. The events of Esther take place between 483 and 473. The Feast of Purim is established in 472. And then, in 457 BC, we have the second return of the Jews under Ezra. The Feast of Purim is not one of the feasts prescribed in the law of Moses. It's instituted between the first and second return of the exiles. By the time Ezra led the second return to Jerusalem in 457 BC, Purim would have been celebrated for 16 years, as indicated by chapter 9, verse 19. While those Jews already in Jerusalem, returning with Zerubbabel in 536 BC, would have observed the Feast of Purim, they would not have known, they had limited knowledge as to why. Being part of the Persian Empire, they would have received Haman's edicts calling for the destruction of the Jews, and Mordecai's edict allowing self-defense. They would have been part of the action that killed 75,000 Persians. They would have received Mordecai's edict calling for the observance of Purim. But being so far from Susa and all the intrigue that went on, they would have not known why all this occurred. The book of Esther is the ancient equivalent of Paul Harvey's The Rest of the Story. For those of you of below a certain age, Paul Harvey was a radio newsman from the 50s to the 70s. He had a midday news program on one of the major stations. At the end of his hour-long program, he would have what he called the rest of the story. He would take a person or an event that's well known to everyone, and he would give the backstory as to how that person got to that particular point at that particular time, or how that particular situation developed. And when he finished it all off, he'd say, "And now you know the rest of the story." You can almost see the scenario unfold. Zerubbabel leads the exiles back to Jerusalem in 536 BC. They live there in relative peace under Persian rule. And then some 63 years later, they get these very disturbing edicts in the name of the king. The Jews are to be destroyed, but they can defend themselves. There's the attacks, the self-defense, the edict to celebrate this new feast. 16 years later, Ezra comes to Jerusalem with the second group of exiles. Knowing that Ezra was there, they ask, "What happened?" Then Ezra begins to tell them a story. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, and so on. However, if your understanding of Esther is only one of a Jewish girl becomes queen and saves her people, you miss a great deal. Again, Martin Luther said the book contained no gospel content. He was wrong. I think the greatest theme here is the providence of God. We've spoken of it earlier, and it can be seen throughout the book. Matthew Henry said, "If the name of God is not here, his finger is." All these coincidences are God's work. Nothing just happens. It shows his care for his people and the surety that his plans cannot be foiled. The book shows the need to accept personal responsibility. Mordecai tells Esther this is the time that she may have been made queen for. This is the moment. She's the only one who has the ability to influence the king. Had she declined, her family would have suffered the same fate. Even so, Mordecai was certain that if she had not acted, salvation of the Jews would be accomplished in some other way. That's faith. And of course, Esther exhibited her faith when she made the decision to go see the king, saying, "If I die, I die." It's the story of the absurdity of wickedness. Haman's ego had been destroyed by Mordecai. Haman's revenge was not just to destroy Mordecai, but all the Jews. And his grand plan came back on his own head. And you can't help but laugh. The Feast of Purim, more accurately, the Festival of Purim, is the only non-religious, purely secular observance in Judaism. Purim comes from the Persian word pur, meaning lot, which Haman cast to determine the date for the destruction of the Jews. It is a joyous, raucous celebration. One Jewish website described it as the Jewish Mardi Gras. The celebration begins at sunset, the day before, when the congregation gathers in the synagogue for the fast of Esther, and the book of Esther is read, along with the story of Moses and the Amalekites. The book of Esther is one of 5 books that are read annually in the synagogue. The others are the Song of Solomon at the Sabbath before the Passover, Ruth at the Feast of Weeks, Ecclesiastes at the Feast of Booths, and Lamentations, commemorating the destruction of the temple by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC, and the third exile into Babylonian captivity. The book is still read from a parchment scroll written with a goose quill. Esther and Ruth are the only 2 books that may be read by a woman in the synagogue. During the celebration, the children are given rattles called gregors, and when the name of Haman is read, they make noise and the people boo and hiss to blot out the name of Haman. A curse on Haman is also recited. In medieval Italy and Germany, the children would burn an effigy of Haman. The next day, there's the giving of gifts and food to the poor, and a common celebratory meal with significant drinking. The Talmud, that is the central text of Rabbinic Judaism and the primary source of Jewish law and theology, says that one should drink until you're not able to tell the difference between cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordecai. Purim plays are performed complete with costumes. Puppet plays are performed for the children. The celebration ends with another fast from sunset to dawn to again commemorate the fast of Esther. Well, that'll do it for this lesson. Next time we'll begin an examination of the text of the book, beginning with chapter 1. Until then, may God bless you.